Good evening and welcome. I'm Michael Usher. This is the latest from 7 News this Monday evening. Breaking news tonight, more schools to close tomorrow, now including one in Melbourne as COVID-19 cases spike in Australia. A full breakdown of the latest numbers and the areas affected state by state. We asked for your questions and concerns all day. Tonight, we'll put those to our medical experts to clear up any confusion. Lockdown will cross to Italy and the US, where numbers are rising and new extreme prevention measures are underway. Financial meltdown, the third worst trading day ever on the Australian share market. Gemma Acton and Tim Lester on the economic fallout and political solutions. Turning Point, it's our new segment. When life takes a sharp turn, our first guest is Mary Custis, an honest conversation about the moment she almost gave it all away. And a most glamorous exit, the celebrity royals Harry and Meghan on their last duty before departure. We begin, of course, with the COVID-19 outbreak, with rising numbers across the country and the globe. There's a lot to take in, but tonight we're going to take our time and make sure you have the information you need. Soon I'll be joined by our medical experts, but first let's get the lay of the land. Angela Cox is in the studio with the very latest figures. Ange, good evening. Now, Australian cases continue to grow.
Michael, Australia-wide, we now have 93 confirmed cases of COVID-19, with many more people quarantined waiting for results. And we've lost 3 people to the virus. The latest victim is an 82-year-old man. He was a resident at the same nursing home in Sydney, where another resident had already succumbed to the virus. Today, we saw several new cases identified across the country. In all, New South Wales has recorded 47 cases, 7 new cases today. Of particular concern, 3 students from 2 separate schools in Sydney. They've been shut down as officials work out who the students had contact with. Moving to Victoria, where there have been 15 cases all up. 3 new cases have been identified. That's the state's biggest jump in one day. All of the cases are people who have just returned from overseas, 2 from America and 1 from Iran. Melbourne is also shutting down a school there tomorrow because of coronavirus concerns. Let's go to Queensland, where there are 15 cases. The latest, a 38-year-old mother. She has a young child at a daycare centre on the Sunshine Coast. Heading across the country, there are 6 cases in WA, 2 new cases today, including a woman who visited a concert hall, prompting British comedian Russell Brand to cancel his shows. In South Australia now, 7 cases all up, but no new cases were discovered over the state's long weekend. Also, no new cases for Tasmania, which is sitting on 2, or the Northern Territory, where there is only 1 case. Let's have a look now at what's happening around the world. Of course, China still has the most deaths, just over 3,000. But now, just have a look at Italy. It's jumped ahead of South Korea with 366 deaths compared to 50. Also, the US has just confirmed 22 people have died there out of more than 500 cases. Now, Michael, we've already seen the coronavirus wreak havoc on world financial markets over the past few weeks. Well, today was a bloodbath with a combination of coronavirus fears and an oil price war. The Australian share market had its worst day since the global financial crisis, and London's FTSE has just had a nightmare opening. Of course, our network finance editor Gemma Acton will be here very soon to break all of that down for you.
Ange, thank you. Let's get more in New South Wales now, where we've so far seen the most cases. The 2 Sydney schools that closed today are St Patrick's Maris College in Dundas, where 2 students were diagnosed, and Willoughby Girls, where 1 pupil is confirmed to have the virus. The State's Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, today issued a serious warning to parents. Have a listen.
This is likely to be the new norm. We have established now a clear orthodoxy, and that is that if a child is found to have, I must say a child or a staff member, or any other person within the school for that matter, is found to have the COVID-19 virus, then effectively a breather will be taken.
Let's bring in Serena Andaloro at St Patrick's Maris College. Serena, good evening. Big words from the New South Wales Health Minister. Have parents at these schools reacted? What are they saying?
They are indeed, Michael. Well, we saw this situation at Epping Boys High last Thursday, of course. Parents are being cooperative. They were called to collect their children today. It was deemed simply too risky to put them all on buses and send them home. But here at Willoughby Girls High, as well as at St Patrick's at Dundas, classes were cancelled today and tomorrow after 3 students tested positive to coronavirus. A girl and a boy in Year 10 at St Patrick's, as well as a girl in Year 7 here at Willoughby Girls High. Now, authorities, they're putting on their detective hats trying to trace exactly where these students have been, who they've come into contact with, and they're thoroughly disinfecting the schools and the grounds to ensure any residual virus or anything left over, it does not spread any further. Now, we can expect similar stories of disruption and chaos in the education system in the coming weeks and months. Now, some parents today at nearby schools were simply not taking any risks. They were pulling their kids out as a precaution. Michael?
All right, Serena in Sydney, thank you. There's breaking news out of Melbourne tonight where a school there is to close its doors tomorrow because of a link to coronavirus. It comes as 3 more Victorian cases were confirmed. Let's bring in our reporter, Laurel Irving in Melbourne. Laurel, good evening to you. So the school in question, it's Carey Baptist Grammar School. What do we know about the case and other new cases?
Michael, an email just went out to parents a few hours ago from the principal saying that there's an adult in the school community who's had direct contact with somebody who does had COVID-19 and that person is showing similar symptoms. And so the school will be closed tomorrow while they await the results of those tests. And you're right, Victoria has 3 more confirmed cases today. That's the biggest jump in a day since this coronavirus crisis began. We now have 15 cases. These new cases are a woman who's come from Iran. She's at home. We have 2 from the US, including one man in his 50s who then went to a bar in North Melbourne and then a cinema in Carlton on March the 5th before he tested positive. So authorities are trying to trace his contacts. Now, he was on the same flight as Dr. Chris Higgins, a GP who tested positive over the weekend. Now, he had just mild cold symptoms and a runny nose, was getting over it, so went back to work and treated patients before then testing positive. Now, that decision was criticised by the Health Minister, who said she was flabbergasted. He said she'd misrepresented the situation and demanded an apology. Well, she certainly wasn't giving that today. Take a listen.
I understand that this may be distressing for the individuals involved. And I'm sorry if they feel distressed, but we have to absolutely focus on the task at hand.
All right, Laurel, on another front, Melbourne's Grand Prix, speculation about big public events and what happens with them, but the green light for this weekend.
Absolutely, and that is on the advice of health experts who say go about your business. Major events and big crowds are still okay because in Victoria we still have not had any what they call community transmissions. So the virus is still not spreading through the community. The only cases have come from overseas, and of course we saw 86,000 people at the MCG last night for the Women's T20 World Cup. And so while we've got the Bahrain Grand Prix now saying it's going to go ahead without spectators, not only will our Grand Prix go ahead as planned on Sunday, it will most certainly go ahead with spectators. And frankly, our tourism industry needs it. This is a huge month for major events here in Melbourne, and the industry has very much been suffering because of coronavirus and the bushfires, of course, too. So all systems go for the Grand Prix, Michael.
It was certainly, and it's good news. It's only a big public showing at the cricket last night too. It was a good turnout. All right, Laurel Irving in Melbourne. Thank you. Well, today we asked you to send in your pressing coronavirus questions and concerns for us to put forward to our panel of experts. And tonight I'm joined by Emeritus Professor of Medicine at the University of New South Wales, John Dwyer, who had an integral part in Australia's fight against the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and Infectious Diseases Specialist, Associate Professor Sanjaya Senanayake from the Australian National University. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining the latest this evening. Professor Dwyer, let me start with you first. Now, we've been overwhelmed with one question in particular from many of our viewers on why more Australian schools and universities aren't being closed to prevent the spread rather than reacting to individual cases. What's your opinion on that?
Well, look, of course, we've had some incidents today where schools found that they had some infected students and the students were sent home. And I think this will probably become more common in the future. But at the moment, the really important thing is that, fortunately in Australia, we simply do not have enough patients being infected to warrant mass closures of schools and daycare centres and the like. That would be an overreaction at the moment.
All right, Sanjaya, let me ask you this. Ava from Sydney has written in asking if the virus can be dormant and if someone can carry it for months with no symptoms before it flares up.
Michael, at this stage, we don't think so. We think the incubation period of this virus, which is the time from when you get infected to when you get sick, is up to 14 days, possibly a bit longer, but certainly not dormant for months.
All right, John, back to you. Today, Australia's Chief Medical Officer announced clinics will have separate entrances for patients with suspected coronavirus. Do you expect we'll be seeing more of these, I guess, drastic measures in the coming weeks?
Yes, Michael, I think this is our future. It would be an absolute disaster, especially with winter coming, if we had a lot of our health professionals who were exposed to this virus, couldn't work, etc. But it's entirely appropriate at the moment for people who need to be tested to go to specialised centres where the people who will collect the samples to test them for the virus have special protective equipment and the environment is secure in terms of other people around. And it's a new way of doing business, but people are going to have to get used to it.
John, in fact, it's a question from me, and I've been wondering it all day. Are our GPs equipped to handle this, do you think, at the moment? Are they getting the right information? Are they being given the right support?
Look, I think over the last couple of weeks there's been an acceleration of interaction between health professionals, academic bodies that help with health professional matters, and the government. But, Michael, this is so complicated, logistics of this. We are in an environment where we're telling patients to phone their doctors and then have a talk to them. That's all very well and good if you can get through to your doctor. But the information that doctors are getting, I think, is excellent, and I think most GPs are now well aware of the precautions that they need to take for themselves and their patients, and how to order tests and how to get patients safely tested, get the results back and then advise them.
Let me ask you one more before I go back to Sanjaya, and this is a common question we received today. John, Linda from Adelaide, one of the many, saying, when can we expect a cure? Do we expect a vaccine anytime soon?
Well, look, I think that as an immunologist and looking at what's happening with the various laboratories around the world trying to make a vaccine, I am actually very optimistic. But to do that and to test it safely and to have it available to the community, we're looking realistically about the middle of next year. But the really important thing is, I think that we have every reason to think that we will have an effective vaccine, and that's really good news, because that's what we really need to change the whole nature of this global epidemic.
All right, that is good news. A bit of time, but good news. So, Sanjaya, lots of people have asked questions about those who've recovered from the virus. Many people are, we should reiterate that, including this question from Trina in New South Wales, who asked if it's possible to catch it a second time. Do we have information on that yet?
Michael, we don't have data on whether people catch it a second time, but we do know that there are other coronaviruses around that infect humans and cause the common cold, and we get at least short-term immunity after we get those infections, but it is possible that maybe after a couple of years you're susceptible again. So we'll have to see with this particular virus how it plays out.
John, Debbie from Adelaide asks, is there any way to test if you've already had the virus, but just perhaps dismissed it as the flu, another strain of the flu?
Well, that's a really important question, because as many of your viewers will know, we usually after an infection we can do blood tests and see if those magic antibodies have been produced that will have helped to eradicate the virus and protect you into the future. And it's only in the last couple of weeks that scientists in China and in Singapore have announced that they are producing tests that will enable us to look for antibodies. Those tests are not available in Australia yet, and I don't expect them to be available immediately.
And just whilst I have you on that subject, John, clarify what is the current mode of testing, and will we see more of it?
We do not in Australia at the moment do blood testing for this virus. Much of the world does, and the sooner we have blood tests available here and are using it widely, the better. They're on the way. But at the moment, we're looking in secretions, nasal secretions, back of throat, etc., for evidence that the virus is present.
Why don't we have the blood testing yet?
I think that there's been a shortage around the world of the testing kits, and I'm not sure when they will be available in Australia, but of course there is every effort being made to provide those for us, because we also need to be doing a lot more just general testing in the population to get a better idea of how widespread this virus is or is not in the community.
Sanjay, you'd no doubt agree with that as well. Let me ask you an interesting question in here from Iran, where there's been a particular outbreak of this. This person's asking, why is it spreading so rapidly in the southern hemisphere where it's still warm, and shouldn't that decrease the risk of infection?
Well, we certainly know that coronaviruses, so other coronaviruses that cause the common cold, they tend to dominate in winter and early spring, but they can occur all year round. Now, having said that, all the action in the majority of the cases tends to be in the northern hemisphere at the moment, where it is much colder.
Sanjay, whilst I have you also, Melissa from Rockhampton in Queensland has asked if children with asthma and other underlying conditions such as epilepsy, I guess vulnerable children, are at greater risk.
Yeah, it's a good question, and we don't know the answer about children who've got other illnesses. What we do see with this virus is that only about 2.4% of confirmed cases in the Chinese outbreak were in children. Now, it could be that children aren't getting infected, or that children are getting infected but they seem to have a mild illness. But certainly with this COVID-19 outbreak, children overall seem to do better.
And Sanjay, following up on that question too, a lot of people have written in today asking how can you be sure if you're pregnant that the COVID-19 is not going to affect you, or can it affect people who are pregnant?
So we haven't got great peer-reviewed evidence about pregnancy and this virus. What we know in general about pregnancy is that pregnancy can alter the immune system. So pregnant women can be more susceptible to certain infections, including respiratory infections such as influenza. And we know that with other coronaviruses, such as SARS and MERS, that there have been reports of stillbirths and miscarriages. But as to whether that's the case with this current COVID-19 coronavirus, we don't know.
John, let me come back to you briefly. Our healthcare workers, you have to feel for them. They're on the front line of it. How do we protect our healthcare workers? What do we do?
Well, look, the really important thing, as I said before, is, and it's very unusual, is to try and keep infected patients away from healthcare workers. Much of the success or otherwise we're going to have with controlling this virus is going to be about educating the community to be real partners with health professionals in trying to minimise this spread. We need to have these mechanisms in place where patients can be advised over the phone or in other ways, but not come into physical contact with healthcare workers. Tactics are like having a sign outside a doctor's office saying, please do not walk through this door if you've got these following symptoms, and in emergency departments and special clinics that are being set up, telling people that this is where you've got to go if you want to interact with a health professional. These tactics are crucial because we know that if we do get a significant amount of infection in our healthcare workers, then we'll have even more problems than we have now.
John, final question in this panel as well. A lot of people asking that we're heading into the flu season anyway. Last flu season was bad without the coronavirus. What impact is that going to have on the coronavirus outbreak at dealing with two fronts, if you like?
Oh, look, I think that's another crucial question, Michael, and terribly important that we talk to the community about this as well, because we have to have a number of beds available to treat really sick people with coronavirus, and we're trying to look after our usual cohort of very sick people with the flu. Life's going to be very difficult. You know, we know that people who are most likely to suffer significant illness with coronavirus are older people, and they're also the same people who often get into trouble with flu. We don't want to have that double whammy. And if people are immunised against the flu and therefore are making less demands on the health system because they're not getting sick, that's all of the good. So a major strategy that we need to put in place immediately is to talk to the community about the absolute crucial importance of being vaccinated against the flu this season.
All right, important advice. John, thank you so much, and Sanjaya as well, for answering all these questions. There are many, many more as well, but we got to all the key topics for now, and we'll look forward to talking to you again, because obviously we're going to have to keep the attention and the spotlight on this, on giving some good solid information to the public. Sanjaya and John, thank you for joining The Latest.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Now, if we didn't exactly get to your question tonight, tune into The Latest on Facebook Watch tomorrow afternoon, where I'll have another specialist panel and go through your queries. We'll also try to get back to all of you on your social media channels, but think we got to the key subjects there. Well, it's been a ragged ride for share market investors since the market high, a record high of February 20, but today's $137 billion wipeout was the worst one-day session since the GFC. Let's bring in our network finance editor, Gemma Acton now. Gem, good evening to you. Big day. Hopes for a near-term recovery, though, they seem to be fading.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely saw investor fears ramp up over the weekend, and that started to play out as soon as markets opened here in Australia this morning. The trigger was growing concerns that the world is soon going to be awash with an oversupply of oil. We see that oil demand is falling as global travel and global business activity is dialed back, and at the same time the main oil producing nations cannot agree on how to cut output. There were critical meetings last Friday and Russia and Saudi Arabia weren't able to agree, and we saw the oil price drop by 30%, which is a tremendous fall. On the back of that, that led through to energy stocks plummeting, and they were the worst performers today in Australia. Now, it's very clear at this point that the interest rate cuts pushed through by the US Federal Reserve and the Reserve Bank of Australia last week haven't helped. So there's a lot of focus now on whether government packages will be able to help get businesses through the worst of it, but it's looking very bleak. Right now, the UK, France, German markets are all open, all down around 6%, and it's certain we're going to see a big sell-off in the US when that opens in a couple of hours' time. So we really are staring down a bear market here in Australia.
OK, bear market, for those of us who don't know, please explain, and what's going to happen?
Yes, so a bear market is when you get a 20% drop in share prices from a recent high. And right now in Australia, we've already lost 19.5% since the recent high on February 20. So I can't really see how we can avoid a bear market tomorrow, and there's certain to be a lot of chatter about it this week.
We're going to hear a lot about a bear market then in days to come.
Yeah.
All right, impact on consumers, what is that?
Look, there are many impacts. Some of the more obvious ones is the average balance super portfolio will certainly be hit. About half of that is in shares, so looking at mid to high single-digit sell-offs already in the last few weeks alone. The interest rate cut has had an impact. Savings rates cut again today. Commonwealth Bank cut their savings rates. On the other hand, mortgage rates have been passed through across the board, so that will be helpful for the hip pocket. And also, talking about the hip pocket, petrol prices are going to be a lot lower because of this. We're seeing some economists say $1 to $1.10 in the next week or so. So
should come down.
That certainly should come down. Yeah, we've got the ACCC keeping an eye on that as well, so it should get passed through.
We'll be talking more about this all week, Gemma. Good on you. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, still to come, we head overseas as large parts of Italy go into complete lockdown and cases and deaths rise in the USA. New details from Canberra tonight, the Prime Minister going into bat for small businesses hit by the virus. We'll also get to some other news headlines, including new evidence at the inquest into the disappearance of William Tyrrell and Harry and Meghan's last official engagement before wrapping up their royal duties. It was all coming up next in the latest from 7 News. Back in a minute. Pay your invoices. That will be the Prime Minister's message to big business tomorrow as the coronavirus crisis hits smaller companies hard. The latest has seen the speech Scott Morrison will give to a business breakfast in Sydney tomorrow, and our political correspondent Tim Lester joins us with some of the details. Tim, good evening to you. What more can you tell us?
Well, Michael, he is preparing to tell the Business Summit whatever you thought 2020 was going to be, think again. It's now about protecting the health, well-being and livelihoods of Australians. He will then single out big business as having a huge role to play. In the draft speech, he tells them, go back to the office today and pay your supplier invoices, not just in time, but ahead of time. This reflects the government's worry that the virus and its economic effects are going to send small businesses broke, and that is going to point the economy in the direction of a recession. Michael?
And Tim, the government's also finalising its own plan to combat the economic impact?
Yes, this is temporary measures to help affected businesses steer their way through the worst of this. Cabinet's Inner Expenditure Review Committee, that's just the Prime Minister, Deputy Prime Minister, Economic Ministers and Health Minister, will meet tomorrow to finalise the plan. Once they've finished, they take it to a full Cabinet meeting to be ticked off. Michael, we'd expect that the final plan will be ready for public release any time from Wednesday morning.
All right, Tim Lester in Canberra again. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Now, to a concerning development in this health crisis from Italy. There's been a stark rise in the number of people who've died from coronavirus. 133 deaths recorded in just one day. Let's bring in Delia Gallagher now. Delia, thank you so much for joining the latest. What's behind the jump in fatalities?
Well, you know, Michael, as the numbers come in, more people are being tested. The fatalities now at 366. Italian authorities say many of them, of course, are elderly with pre-existing conditions. But this spike in numbers that we saw this weekend was the reason that the government overnight, Saturday and Sunday, decided to put in these new measures, which are not only affecting a lockdown in the north, but also important changes for the rest of the country as well.
We're certainly seeing some radical steps there to stop the spread of the virus, as you suggested. What is being done, Delia?
Well, the first thing they're doing is locking down the north, which is where the central concentration of the virus is. People there have restricted freedom of movement. There are controls. There is a fine of up to €200 and a risk of 3 months of jail time if you don't have a good work or health reason for moving. But in the rest of the country, Michael, I have to tell you, they have shut down mainly all public spaces, museums, the Colosseum, schools are shut down, and they are encouraging people to stand 3 feet away from each other if they are in public spaces. We were talking to one restaurant owner who was saying, I don't know how my waiters are going to bring food to the table if they have to stand 3 feet away. And then he said, well, of course, not a lot of people are even coming. So there is a big economic concern as well amongst the tourism restaurant industry. In fact, the finance ministry just a few hours ago said they are going to put support measures in place for workers and those industries that are going to be most affected by the temporary, hopefully, economic downturn here.
All right. CNN correspondent Delia Gallagher, thank you. Freedom is in sight for 4 Australians among thousands of passengers stranded on a cruise ship off California after an outbreak of coronavirus on board. Let's bring in our US correspondent, Amelia Brace. Now, Amelia, the ship is set to dock in the coming hours.
Well, that's certainly the plan, Michael, though I think the passengers on board the Grand Princess will believe it when they see it. They have now been confined to their small cabins since last Thursday. The captain has warned, though, that even once this ship does dock, it will take days to get all of those people off board. We know that priority will be given to the 21 people who have tested positive for coronavirus, but also that everyone else on board will have to be tested and quarantined, even if they're not showing any symptoms. US residents will go to army bases around the country, and ideally international passengers will be repatriated to their home country. So still a long road ahead for these people, at least 14 days in quarantine, but at least it looks like today there will be finally some movement and it will be towards land. Michael?
Amelia Brace in California, thank you. Still to come, we're live to Amsterdam for the very latest from the trial surrounding the downing of MH17, plus the son of 2 Australian passengers joins us. New developments in the search for William Tyrrell. We crossed to Tyrrell, where that inquest into the missing toddler is underway again. And she's the Greek goddess who's been entertaining Australia for decades. But did you know Effie's time in the spotlight was almost cut short? Well, Mary Custis explains the turning point that almost ended her career in the middle of a live performance. That's next.
He's made headlines, but he's spoken to no one. He's shocked Australia countless times, but maintained his silence. The most shocking is still to come, when Ben Cousins breaks his silence. Only on on 7.
As we go to air, nearly 6 years after Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was shot down, the trial of 4 men charged over the incident is right now underway in the Netherlands. Our Europe Bureau Chief Hugh Whitfield joins me live from Amsterdam now. Hugh, good evening to you. The accused, they are not there, but this is a very significant development for families of the victims. What's happened inside so far?
Yeah, Michael, the court hearing is now underway. The trial inside this huge court complex, which is right next door to Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, where that plane took off from on the 17th of July 2014. As you say, the 4 men accused of mass murder are not here, but interestingly, one of the Russian men, Oleg Pulatov, has had lawyers turn up to the court today, so he is legally represented, and that could cause some issues going forward. It wasn't expected that any of the 4 men would have lawyers here, but they got the brief of evidence back in January and are now saying they may not have had time to go through the evidence. 36,000 pages of evidence that's been collected by this joint investigation team made up of 5 countries: Ukraine, Belgium, Malaysia, the Netherlands, and of course Australia. It's lasted 5.5 years with investigators on the ground here in Amsterdam, but also at the crime scene in Ukraine. A very difficult crime scene to work through, considering that the plane came down in what was and what remains an active war zone. 500 police officers from Australia's federal police have been involved, and I sat down with the commander for the AFP here in Europe, Jennifer Hurst.
The skills and the disciplines that have been used to gather that evidence are world-class, Hugh. We all hope that the evidence will be tested in court and that those responsible will be held to account.
Hugh, we certainly hope so, but without the 4 accused men present, what happens if they are found guilty? Is this purely a symbolic verdict then?
Well, look, Russia would certainly argue that this is a bit of a show trial, but it will lay out a huge amount of evidence for the world to see. And the investigation will continue for at least another 12 months alongside the court proceedings. And this will take a long time. 25 weeks has been set aside over the next 13 months. Victims' families will have a chance to give family impact statements. And of course, there are 298 victims in this, so that will take time as well. But Russia doesn't seem keen to hand over these 4 men. They either are in Russia or in that rebel-controlled area of eastern Ukraine around Donetsk. So the chances of anyone going to jail over this do appear fairly slim. Those international arrest warrants remain active. And I guess the most interesting thing out of all of this today is that one of those men, as I say, is now legally represented. He will be fighting this case using Dutch Defence Counsel. So it will be a long week this week initially, basically laying out how this is all going to work and the beginning of that evidence to be heard. But it's going to be a long process for those families who've travelled here to Amsterdam to see how this all plays out.
All right, Hugh Whitfield in Amsterdam, thanks for that tonight. And before tonight's broadcast, Angela Cox spoke with Paul Gard, whose parents, Roger and Jill, were among the 38 Australians killed when that flight MH17 was shot down in 2014.
Paul Gard, thanks so much for joining us here on The Latest. Firstly, let's talk about your mum and dad, because it's very important we never forget the victims. What were Roger and Jill like?
Well, they were great parents. They looked after us right through our lives up until 2014, and they were very caring and kind people. They were both professionals, both scientists, both very loving and caring, so we do miss them very much.
So the trial is about to get underway. You've waited a long time for this. How are you feeling about what's going to come out?
Well, for me, I suppose the most useful thing is it might shine a spotlight on exactly why and how the Russian government was involved in the war and how that missile launcher came to be in the eastern Ukraine. But for me, again, it's more a function of a terrible tragedy that happens in a time of warfare. I don't think anyone intended to bring down a passenger plane, so in that sense I've kind of moved on, but obviously for the facts to come out, that will be useful for a lot of families.
So what are the main questions you want answered?
Well, I think certainly the extent of the Russian involvement is a key one. I mean, Russia has denied all responsibility, and one of the key problems for families is a lot of families really just wanted an acknowledgement of responsibility and an apology, which hasn't obviously been forthcoming. So if the Russian government can be persuaded to own up to its involvement, if that's indeed what happened, then that would be progress for a lot of families.
How do you feel about the fact that none of the 4 men on trial will even actually be in the court?
Well, it's to be expected, I guess, given the constitutional position of Russia not letting anyone extradite their citizens. So we're not really surprised by that. But clearly, it's unfortunate. But there's a few different legal things going on. The Australian and Netherlands governments are also holding the Russian government to account separately. So there's a few different ways in which the pursuit of justice is being carried out.
So what would bring you closure after this trial?
Well, again, I've kind of always been focused on the conflict itself. I'd prefer to see that conflict resolved, and also, generally speaking, to make it safer for people who are flying over conflict zones. Certainly we don't hold out hope there in getting any closure, but certainly for some families it'll be really useful to have their day in court and to present what the tragedy has meant for them.
Your parents obviously lost their lives there. Is it important for you to ever go back?
I can see myself going to the Ukraine once to that area once the area is peaceful and some sort of semblance of order and normality has returned, but I don't think that will be anytime soon.
Okay, Paul, thank you so much for joining The Latest.
No problem.
Brisbane woman Hannah Clark was today remembered as one of the greatest mums to walk this earth as she and her 3 children were laid to rest. The young family was killed in that horrific act of domestic violence, ambushed in their car, set alight by the children's father. Let's bring in our reporter Joel Dry, who was at the service today. Joel, truly terrible circumstances, but today the Clark family was determined to focus on the positive. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there were about 5 speeches, Michael, really close friends and family that addressed the crowd of about 1,000 mourners at a church on the south side of Brisbane, and all of them shared some pretty similar sentiments, and that was the amazing mother that Hannah Clark was to her 3 children, Aaliyah, Leanna and Trey. There was so many stories that painted a picture of this mum and how much she was loved by so many, how fiercely she protected her 3 children. And listening to those stories, you got a sense of the fact she was the type of person that you wanted to be around. She was really driven, a really dedicated and talented fitness trainer. So there was plenty of laughter for sure, but no doubt a lot of tears. That image of the single casket with all 4 bodies inside was just heartbreaking. But what there wasn't was any discussion of the tragic circumstances that brought everyone together today. No mention of the ex-partner or the father of the 3 children who tragically murdered them some 3 weeks ago. But there was plenty of chat about how fiercely Hannah fought to keep her kids protected. Sadly, a fight, Michael, that she wasn't able to win.
Indeed, Joel. Some many good words said there today. Let's hear from Hannah Clark's best friend and brother, Nat.
A legacy of bravery and resilience, of strength, but most of all, a legacy of love. There will never be a day I don't think of you. I would have laid down my life for you. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you.
I love that we had you back in our lives, and that our kids got to make so many great memories. 2020 was going to be the best year, as you told Stacey. You were looking forward to finally being happy.
And Joel, the family requested some special guests attend the service. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, post the service there was a private wake for family and friends. But before that, the family wanted to take some time out to meet and greet the first responders from that tragedy a couple of weeks ago. They personally wanted to thank the paramedics, the police officers and firefighters who were there at the last moments of those 4 precious lives. That's a really touching moment that was private, no doubt. You can only imagine the grief and sentiments that would have been shared between those 2 parties. And that feeling is now going to be carried on by the family. They have set up a charity called Small Steps for Hannah. What they intend to do with that is in some way help some of those victims of domestic violence who are going through the same sort of things that Hannah did. So even in this tragedy, there will be a touching legacy that will be forever in debt of Hannah and her 3 children.
All right, Joel Dry in Brisbane, thank you for that. Tonight, police are on the hunt for sword-wielding thieves who held up a service station in the Sydney suburb of Georges Hall. Peter Mondadu was cornered as he closed up for the night. A getaway driver was waiting in a black ute. The bandits fleeing with around $1,000 cash. 7 children remain behind bars tonight after 2 separate police pursuits in Adelaide. 4 teenagers and a 10-year-old boy were arrested after a patrol car spotted a speeding stolen Hyundai sedan. In another incident, 2 15-year-olds were charged with illegal use of a motor vehicle after failing to stop in an allegedly stolen Mazda CX-5. All 7 of those children have been refused bail. They're due to face court tomorrow. The inquest into the disappearance of William Tyrrell has resumed, with a witness repeatedly pressed over what may have been the last sighting of the little boy. Let's bring in our reporter Robert Avadia, who's in Tyrrell tonight. Rob, good evening to you. Now, the witness is Ronald Chapman. He's adamant he saw William in a Spider-Man suit in the back of a car seat. Where does the doubt come in?
Good evening, Michael. Yeah, adamant he is, in his words, 100%. Absolutely no doubt. It was William Tyrrell he saw in the back of a fawn-coloured car in tandem with a blue-coloured car that went past his house, 1.4 kilometres from where William went missing, or at least when he was last seen. The greatest doubt, however, on Ronald Chapman's story came in the form of witness Kelly Lee. She spoke to the inquest today saying she has a son, or had a son, about a year older than William. Very similar features too. Also would wear a Spider-Man suit and would frequently drive past Mr. Chapman's house. So there was the suggestion perhaps that it is she and her son that Mr. Chapman had seen. So when Mr. Chapman gave that evidence the first time in the inquest late last year, it was a bit of a bombshell, somewhat startling, but now some serious doubts over what he saw.
All right, Robert Avadia and Tyrrell, thank you. Still to come, you know her name, you know her face, but tonight, Mary Custis reveals her turning point, the surprising moment that changed everything for the actress and comedian.
And I was starting to sort of feel a little out of control and starting to feel feelings I hadn't felt before.
It was George right? Did it feel like a public execution?
It did.
In her most intimate interview of her career, with the help of family and friends, Mary explores the moment she almost quit comedy. That's next in our news segment here on The Latest from 7 News. Welcome to Turning Point, a new series of interviews on The Latest here on 7 News. Now, in each, we sit down with a well-known Australian and, along with their family and friends, we'll talk about the one time, the one place, the one moment that changed everything. We begin with the woman known fondly as Effie, the charming, cheeky and effervescent Greek goddess. But behind the funny facade, actress and comedian Mary Custis has been on an emotional roller coaster for the past decade. She's been very open about much of it: an IVF struggle, losing a child, welcoming another. But amongst all of that, there was one moment that changed the course of her career and her life. Mary was on stage during a show dressed as Effie when something happened, a dramatic shift in perspective. It nearly saw her quit comedy on the spot. This is Mary Custis's Turning Point. Well, Mary, thank you for joining me now. Good to have you on The Latest.
Good to see you.
Likewise. Let's talk about that turning point, 12th of May 2012, when you were preparing to go back on stage exactly 1 year after losing Stevie. What do you remember in the lead up to that moment?
I got a call asking me to do a show for 3 nights, and I said yes automatically, as I would have in the past. So I had to get to work and start writing the show, and that was all fine, and that was familiar to me. And then in the month leading up to the first performance, I couldn't remember a single word. Like, I'd never tried harder to learn lines in my life, and it was just like a sieve. I couldn't remember anything. And on the actual night of the first performance, we drove to the theatre, and I was starting to panic a little bit. And I don't suffer from nerves. I worry, but I don't suffer from nerves. And this panic was starting to take over, and I was thinking, how can I do a show when I don't remember the words? And I was really concerned about that. And then I walked into the theatre, and I was very confronted by the intimacy of it. And I was starting to sort of feel a little out of control and starting to feel feelings I hadn't felt before. I was just so raw from the loss of Stevie, and And weirdly, I hated the idea of anyone laughing at me, which is odd when you're doing comedy, right? I didn't want to be a joke, you know, and I felt like I wasn't the same girl since the experience, and I felt like all my you know, organs and, you know, every bit of me, all my nerves and every ending was on the exterior. And so I was waiting backstage, and George saw the panic in my eyes and just left me, because he knew that if we indulged in the conversation, I'd probably not want to do the show. But I'd already made the decision that I wasn't going to do the show. And it would sold out, and the show had started. And so, I made the decision I was going to go out and conveniently collapse. And then as I was walking out and the audience were there and I saw their faces, I thought, I can't do it immediately, it's going to look contrived. So I thought, I'll just grab the mic and I'll say a couple of things and then I'll collapse, you know. I had a plan, you see. And then I just started talking, and then this wave of warmth hit me. This thing that I've loved from the first time I stood on the stage just arrived back into me and filled me with a sense of peace and familiarity and excitement that I hadn't felt.
Well, George was with you that night, your gorgeous husband. Let's take a listen to how he remembers this.
You could see there was a real nervousness in her face, and in fact, she just looked downright scared, actually. And then she came out on stage, and it was as if she'd stepped out into some public execution and fumbled with some jokes and lines, and it was a very awkward minute or so. And from where I was standing at the back of the room, I was holding my breath, but she just powered through. And she lifted, and it was a great night in the end, but boy, the first few minutes was pretty hair-raising.
Gee. Was George right? Did it feel like a public execution?
It did. I felt, well, my story hadn't broken at that point, so nobody knew. And people were, you know, throughout that decade of trying to have a child, I'd bump into fans all the time and they'd say, "Where have you been? It feels like you've fallen off the face of the earth." And I thought, well, if only you'd known where I'd been.
At times, personally, you had.
I did.
Yeah.
You know, you come to a point in your life where you can see the fork very clearly, and you've got to be very careful of the decisions you make. And I could have given up performing that night, because if I did go through with collapsing, I know that I wouldn't have dared to have performed again.
That would have been it. It
would have been it.
David Mitchell, who's collaborated with you on many things, but with a date with Effie particularly, at the time he had no idea what you've been going through, particularly about losing Stevie. Let's have a listen to him about how he remembers that performance.
Mary was extremely nervous before that first performance up in Kincumber of A Date with Effie. She didn't think she could remember the lines. She was scribbling, you know, key words on bits of cardboard and putting them on the floor of the nightclub. It was very tightly packed. There was a huge audience. It was really, the tension was just unbelievable. She walked on and blitzed them from the very beginning. And I only later found out that she was, you know, having a nerve crisis.
Michael, listen to Michael's voice. It's very masculine. What's that thing you've got dangling there? I wasn't talking about that. No, I'm joking.
I mean, she was hilarious, and you could just see her eyes that had been frightened before suddenly sparking, and she was firing again, and Effie was back, and she hasn't stopped since.
Do you remember that spark moment?
I do. I remember just, I looked at their faces, the audience, and they were so happy to see me, and I realised that, you know, I was so happy to see them.
You then chose to let the audience, and this was an interesting move, to actually meet Mary, to meet you, rather than Effie, and it was in a monologue, which I think is just extraordinary. Tell us about that.
Well, A Date with Effie started before I fell pregnant with Jamie, because after I lost Stevie, my daughter, I still went back to Greece another 6 times because I just wouldn't give up, would I? And on my 23rd attempt, I fell pregnant with Jamie.
23rd attempt?
Yeah. I'm a Hall of Famer when it comes to IVF. So once my book came out, everyone kept trying to get to Mary, even though I was in character doing this comedy show. They were trying to get to Mary. So I thought with the next show that I did, which was the biggest show I've ever done, my one-woman show, called Effie the Virgin Bride, where the Virgin gets married. The first idea I had for that was to tell that story of that night when I almost gave up acting at the very last moment, when they think that they can't laugh any more than they have. I come out as Mary with a dressing gown on and my hair in pin curls, and they think, oh, there's no lighting state, it's very sort of, looks like maybe there's some technical hitch. Yeah. And I come out and I talk to them as me, and I tell the story of that night, and I recap on, why I was in that state and what had happened to me, and I start to transform into Effie in front of their eyes, slowly, and I tell that moment where I decided to go on with the show, and I say, none of this could have happened without you, I say to my audience, and it's at that moment where I take the dressing gown off and I say, Effie. Yeah. Just say it. It's not that hard, Mary. Effie. Yeah. And the audience, of course, feel completely relieved because they've been crying now for the last 7 minutes, and now I've let them off the hook. They've watched me transform into that character that they came to see, and they got Mary, and they got the love letter that monologue was to my audience and to the character that's allowed me to put all this joy into my life, and hopefully the people that enjoy the character as well.
The people who've helped save you in some way. Now, you have a new show now, Love Me Tinder.
Yes.
How have you changed as a performer since having Jamie, who's just a beautiful girl, and thank you for sharing some photos of her with us as
Pleasure.
well too. So how have you changed as a performer since having her?
Well, I'm definitely more empathetic. I feel people's pain a lot more. I'm closer to laughter, I'm closer to tears, because the grief's still there. And poetically, Mother's Day always falls either the day before or on the day of the anniversary of Stevie's death. So, none of it's been lost. It's always with me. But I was able to turn, that story into such a positive story, not just for me, but for other people like me that have lost children. And I've been able to use the platform that, that I've created for, this career that I've had for over 30 years for something other than, just what serves me. On every level, it's just, I suppose, put everything in HD for me. As an actor, I just love performing now more than I ever have, and I'm doing better work because of all that I've been through and survived.
And if you went back to that one point, that turning point on stage where you were going to fake the collapse and that was it, that would have been it, turned around.
Yeah, I'm really grateful that I didn't give in to the fear, because they say that all decisions are made out of either love or fear, and I chose love that night.
You're a wonderful, loving person. So is George, your husband, and little Jamie too. She's gorgeous. And it's been, again, I've interviewed you a few times, but it's been beautiful speaking with you, Mary. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. Come see the show. It's so funny. Let me make you laugh. Thanks, Michael.
Yeah, and she will too. Mary and Effie are touring Love Me Tinder through March, April and into May. The details will be on the 7 News Twitter and Facebook pages. Still to come, in just a matter of hours, Harry and Meghan will take part in their final official engagement before parting ways with the royal family. We'll go live to London. And a bizarre discovery in the Milky Way. What is it? We'll explain. That's next here on the latest from 7 News. In the coming hours, Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, will fulfil their final royal duty as they attend the annual Commonwealth service alongside the Queen. Let's bring in our reporter there, Sarah Greenhalgh in London. Sarah, hello to you. What can we expect to see?
Michael, good evening. Well, we are about to see the Queen, Charles, Camilla, William and Kate all side by side with the Duke and Duchess of Sussex for the very first time since that Megxit announcement 2 months ago. But it is also simultaneously the last time they will all be together, their last public official duty before walking away from the monarchy and starting this self-imposed exile in Canada. The Commonwealth Day service is a televised event here in the UK. It's a key part of the Queen's calendar. Of course, she is the head of 54 nations, including Australia. But this year it won't won't be about her. All eyes will be on Harry and Meghan, and we are hearing that they won't take part in the Queen's procession like they did last year. Instead, they will go straight to their seats in Westminster Abbey to avoid any extra awkwardness. Tradition dictates they have to sit in the second row behind the other five, so that should make for some interesting photos in itself. As you say, it all kicks off in a couple of hours, and every lip reader and body language expert in the UK will be earning their keep today. They're all on standby.
It will be overanalysed, you can guarantee that. Sarah, look, an end of quite a few ups and downs for the couple and the royal family. What now for Harry and Meghan? Any further detail?
Yeah, so obviously their first priority will be going back to Canada to be reunited with baby Archie, who they didn't bring on this business trip, so to speak. Then they need to figure out what the rest of their lives will look like. As of the 31st of March, they will no longer be allowed to use HRH, so His and Her Royal Highness. We are hearing through reports in the Daily Mirror today that the military will be key to their charitable work going forward. So medical care for injured servicemen and women, veterans, homelessness, both here in the UK and in the US, which is perhaps not surprising given Harry's own military connections. They will also be at the Invictus Games in the Netherlands in May. But they have just been so flawless the past couple of days. They've been here for 5 days during this final farewell tour. They've seemed quite happy, very relaxed, meeting with people really in their element. So it is somewhat of a poignant moment. Quite a shame to see them go. Just 682 days, Michael, since Meghan married into the royal family.
There you go. It's a big last 24 hours for them, and you'll be covering it all. Sarah Greenhalgh in London, thank you. In just a moment, we'll have your final frame and Tuesday's full weather forecasts. That's next on the latest from 7 News. Welcome back. The Canberra Balloon Spectacular kicked off over the weekend, and photographer Paul Durack has been out capturing these beautiful images from Lake Burley Griffin. We'll leave those up and have a look at the temperatures around the country. Sydney, possible showers, 24, partly cloudy and 19 in Hobart, 30 and sunny for Adelaide. In some other parts, sunny and 36 in Mount Isa, Tamworth 26 and partly cloudy, 35 and sunny for Karratha. Astronomers from Sydney University have discovered the first one-sided pulsating star in the Milky Way. At 1,500 light years away, too far to photograph, but this animation shows how it beats according to the gravitational pull of a nearby red dwarf, apparently. Scientists expect to find many more as technology to listen inside the beating hearts of stars improves, which is fascinating. It was a phenomenal International Women's Day for the Australian women's T20 team, claiming victory against India yesterday, their 5th T20 World Cup. Now, post-match, they joined pop star Katy Perry for a dance on stage, their moves bringing a smile to the faces of many Australians in what has been pretty stressful and concerning few weeks. For our final frame tonight, we revisit this magical moment, Captain Meg Lanning hugging Katy Perry. Meg said of the shop, "If anyone knows me, I don't hug many people, and I've just got sheer joy on my face." And that sheer joy is why it is tonight's final frame. Congratulations again. Well, thank you for your company this evening. You can rewatch all our shows on 7+. Sunrise is back first thing from 5:30. For now, though, from the team here at 7 News, that is the latest. I'm Michael Usher. Good night.